we have to give credit to the work that's been done in the craziest of circumstances, in lofts and basements and backyards and guerrilla grows for the last God knows how many decades. But yet we've ended up with this array of cannabis flower that I'm not disappointed with. Are you guys disappointed with? You go to California or Canada, what's available there? You're not disappointed. So first of all, plaudits to that incredible, almost like a citizen science project. Let's all go out and individually breed these crazy lines, and then we'll bring them all together in legalization in 30, 40 years' time, and we'll reap the rewards. That's kind of what's happened.
What good looks like. Dr. Gary Yates is a leading UK-based plant scientist with significant experience in the international cannabis sector. As the global industry opens up, he's tasked with helping companies determine the best way forward when it comes to selecting genetics, developing cultivation techniques, and getting the best possible crop yield. He tells us more about what good looks like, smells, and tastes like when it comes to quality cannabis.
Hello there, and welcome to another episode of the Lobsterpot podcast. I'm Dave Barton, and today I'm feeling very British. How about you, Jamie? Are you as British as I'm feeling today, British and cannabis-like?
Do you know what? I'm really glad you served me up with that, because it's that hot. We've obviously been talking about the weather. We have a Scottish guest today, who I'm sure you'll very profoundly introduce in a moment. And despite being half Scottish and being able to pull off an accent from time to time, there is a phrase I can't say in Scottish that is perfect for today, which is taps off.
Now, see, our guest is laughing now. And so without further ado, I shall introduce him. He is a plant scientist, the Chief Scientific Officer, Farmer Seeds, or Seedsman, as it's also known. His name is Dr. Gary Yates, and he's here with us today. Welcome, Gary. How are you doing?
Yes, very well. Thank you. Thank you for the nice introduction and welcome. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to talking about the crazy British weather, defining what taps off means, and and getting into some cannabis business as well if we've got time.
Yeah, absolutely, sir. But yeah, tell us a little bit about the sort of stuff you're doing day to day. I mean, as a plant scientist, you know everything about kind of cultivation, growing, and all that good stuff, and what good cannabis looks like. And yeah, just give us a bit of an intro, a bit of background about you, Gary.
So one of the privileges that I've had through my cannabis career is that I've got to travel to lots of different places, sometimes as the person who's going to go in there and solve a bunch of problems, which can be very daunting, but it's often fairly straightforward. And to your point, Dave, I think one of the kind of weird things about this industry is I've noticed there's a splicing between what quality is and what is passing certain standards. And I guess we can go into that a little bit more detail, but just to your point, my day-to-day is partly doing cultivation consultancy and troubleshooting. Part of my job is, selecting genetics for breeding programs. Part of my job is to, help everyday growers. I sit on customer service forums and I answer questions to help people who, my leaves have all turned yellow, I don't know why. And overall, this has just given me a wealth of experience that would take a couple of lifetimes, it feels, to gather, because you're just troubleshooting other people's issues, and then it helps cement how not to do things, at least, which sounds a little bit derogatory, but you know what I mean? I always believe you should learn from what you're doing,
100%. And it sounds like, cannabis quality control, but from a whole plant perspective, like, what this is supposed to be, how it's supposed to be. And so you operate internationally, but here in the UK, just to address that for a minute, obviously we have medical cannabis that's legal. The supply is quite limited in terms of, what clinics and dispensaries here can get hold of. And how do you feel? I'm not going to say compare it if you don't want to, but it's kind of like when you have that sort of scenario where it's like you get what you're given, it's, that's not always the best stuff that you're getting. And it's hard as a consumer, as a patient, to kind of, if you don't know, to know, is this the right thing? So when people get medical cannabis, what should they be looking for? Are there any kind of really immediate things that sort of say, if it smells like that, if it looks like that, this is good, this is bad? I know it's not that clear cut, but
it's not. But I think there's it's to go to the other end of the scale. Some of the examples of not satisfactory prescription has been things that smelt like fresh cut grass instead of having a nice, aromatic terpene profile. It just smells like some wet plant material. The other things is texture as well. You can have way over dried, which would be brittle and just breaks up in your hand, and you can have soft and fluffy, which means it's not properly been dried. The other thing is also actually color as well over the drying. And I mean, I've never heard of a prescription serving cultivator doing curing, but at least over the dry, then there's a chemical change in there, and some of that chlorophyll breaks off, and there should be a change in shade of green at least. So there's a few things there that you can look out for. It does, to your point, they take a bit of a keen eye. And I think one of the problems we've had is because it's a recent lessening of prohibition, a lot of the patients have a previous supply to which to compare, the prescription to. And I think there's a discrepancy there in the quality and what is expected. And because we have such stringent EU GMP standards for making measures towards safety, this is somehow being conveyed or misconstrued, I should say, in the industry as some kind of quality standard, which it really is not, because I'm pretty sure you guys have seen, as I have, very poor quality EU GMP approved cannabis.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy, but again, it's that whole, like we say, everyone's focused, or government's focused on kind of harm reduction and, lab testing and ensuring it meets a certain threshold or a certain level of THC or CBD or whatever it might be, depending on what the formulation is. But when it comes to actually getting the flower itself, it's not necessarily what the labs approve is what's necessarily best for consumers or for patients.
Yeah. And again, I think we live in a very medicalized society. Modern medicine is quite a new field of study, right? I mean, technology is coming out as fast as it's being applied these days. And because of that acceleration, I think we've become overly medical in our thought process and taken something which has been traditionally used as a therapeutic medicine for thousands of years and try to categorize it into this modern, it breaks down there because, one effect, one molecule, all this kind of, pharmaceutical approach to it is hard to retrofit on something that is more of a spectrum of complementary molecules, so there's issues, there's bottlenecks in the system that prevent us from actually getting to the best quality medicine, let's call it, because it is at the end of the day. And these bottlenecks are really they're not being addressed as far as I can see. And I must admit, I'm not in touch with every company and that supplies medical cannabis to the UK, but I do know the patients are kind of pained by the standards that they're being faced with. So, a change in the approach there is probably necessary. Maybe in some cases a change in personnel, people coming from other industries who don't understand the particulars about cultivating cannabis, drying cannabis, and then, testing and whatnot beyond that. This can be a real issue. And then also the best growers that I've met tend to grow start to finish and do everything, whereas in the ways that corporations tend to be structured, you have compartmentalization, which then you sometimes lose the overarching vision or the methodology because of that. So I think all those factors play into that lack of consistency, let's call it then, in the medical side.
I think when it comes to medical product and looking at a product that's very much going for a very specific purpose, to help people, it's not the other side of, say, craft growing, where you're going to spend as much time as you can to create the best product you can to then put it in a retail store, and that over time it will sell. Whereas the pressures from the kind of medical industry, especially getting product into the UK with the sort of route to market it has to take, there's, I'm sure, a lot of pressure internally there to just get it done, get it on the van, get it on the plane, get it in, just get it there now. Because a lot of the times, people we speak to have experienced shortages at clinics, and it's like, well, this is what we have left. And that the other side of that is the businesses supplying it are desperately trying to get stuff there. And unfortunately, if the quality standards are in place are only built around safety and not around necessarily product quality, then inevitably things are going to happen where people, you know, misdry, miscure, whatever it is.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess if we take that a step further, and we look at the sourcing of cannabis being brought in, now there's 2 points to make here. First of all, I don't see anyone paying the highest dollar available of the top quality craft to bring it to the medical system. And again, that makes me think that the margins are not there, which means it's profit that's behind it and not a more altruistic thing, which we think we're in this phase of more altruistic, you know, because it's not fully, but it's, those lines are a bit muddy. You know, those waters are a bit muddy, sorry. And that's a problem. And then the second thing would be, we have a system now that is dependent on low cost of production. So what I'm seeing is what they call, I don't know if you're familiar, it's more of a Northern American term, unbucked cannabis. Unbucked means it's like partially trimmed. It's just a rough, take your big leaves off with your hand and you dry it down to, like, you know, a few percent above where it would be, you know, accepted, and then you send it halfway across the world to the UK for it to be finished drying and finished trimming, and then it can be EU GMP. But again, the quality loss and that process, like that all, for me, that all has to be a smooth, you harvest the plant and then you have to manage your light content, you have to manage your temperature, you have to manage your humidity, you know, very, very tightly, in order to preserve the quality of what you've grown. I think, was it you guys I said to the last time about the wine analogy and grapes? Yeah, so you can make the, you know, bad wine from great grapes, but you can also make so you can't make I messed up. You can't make great wine from bad grapes, but you can make bad wine from great grapes, and it's all about what you do after the grow. And it's something that tends to be compartmentalized and not overseen by one person. So
from a, you know, product delivery perspective, the end of the line always gets the most pressure because they're the ones in the way. So it does make sense that those sorts of things happen. It's unfortunate they do. And I wondered, just, you know, touching on the fact that you are indeed a plant scientist, a genuine expert, what are some of the things that are happening if, say, you took a dry from 12 days down to 5? You know, what has to happen to get the moisture content down in that time, and what does that actually do to the plant and the quality of it? Yeah,
so the drying phase of cannabis is a very underdeveloped science, I guess. It's very understudied and is broadly spoken about, and everybody has their own idea, but there's not much science behind what's going on so far. But the people are doing work on that. My take on it is, as if you actively energize, if a plant actively is making energy, then it can metabolize at quite a fast rate. If it's not actively, you know, receiving energy, it can still metabolize, but at a much slower rate. So during that drying process, you want to optimize the conditions so that there's still some metabolic processes going on, which, for example, when you put the plants in complete darkness after harvesting, if you shine a light in there for a long time, some of those cells will start to photosynthesize again, because locally they have all the things they need, light, water, and, you know, a very small amount of nutrients, which they can take from the sugars derived from the photosynthesis cycle the day before. And that brings us to the next point, getting rid of those sugars that are, and I say sugars, we don't mean like stuff you put in your tea. This is more like starch. It's energy source sugars, right? These are, you know, synthesized by photosynthesis during the day and then used as an energy source in the dark phase. So during that phase, you want to use up all those sugars and make sure they're all metabolized down to there's nothing left. And those metabolites will then be secondary metabolites, which will then feed into different pathways, including cannabinoid and terpene synthesis. So the idea for me is to maintain the conditions long enough for the chemistry to keep working as best it can. So we're talking about things that keep happening. Things that we want to stop happening is generation of chloroplasts. These are the organelles in plant leaves that contain chlorophyll, which are the light harvesting pigments, largely. So these are the things where these are the sites of photosynthesis. So we want to, you know, we want to reduce that, because that's what gives the cannabis that green, grassy, fresh cut grass smell.
Yeah.
And if you dry really quickly, you tend not to purge a lot of the chlorophyll. And if you dry really quickly, you tend not to process all those starchy sugar, this whole photosynthesis derived energy sources. So that takes a certain amount of time, especially when it's unenergized. So if you rush it, I think you end up with these problems. And it doesn't matter how well you manage the other parameters of the environment, you're going to compromise, the plant's ability to actually finish. And if you ask most people, they'll say take at least 2 weeks to dry. Most, high-end growers will say that. But it can be done quicker, obviously, and you can get great quality from even less than that. But generally, it's just a really good blueprint to follow, is to let it take its time, make the conditions ambient and don't change them suddenly, and really, really dark. That's really what you want to do.
There's a lot of coming back to, sorry, my mind's trying to rack my brains desperately for, remembering GCSE science now, I think I only stayed around for like the rude bits, but yes, photosynthesis, chlorophyll, all the things that plants need in order to kind of flourish, which I wanted to ask a little bit more about kind of growing specifically. And again, sort of seed selection and genetics and things like that, because again, that's your sort of area of expertise. And obviously you work with Jorge Cervantes, who is like, master grower, extraordinaire. So in terms of, when you get plants to be grown in a certain way, I mean, we're talking about sort of drying, curing, and preserving once they've been harvested. But is there sort of an optimum way? I mean, everyone talks about the difference between indoor and external. I mean, what are the sort of prime conditions for growing really great cannabis, and can they be replicated in other environments, or is it a case of if you're growing it in somewhere like the Caribbean, you've got everything you need, you've got the humidity, you've got the, you know what I mean, but you take that somewhere like Ohio and it's completely different. You can't grow the same quality. Is that the case? Am I on the right lines there? Or
I think it's a case of finding the right plants, the right types of genetics to suit that environment, and then steering those plants towards the adaptation. Right. So it's a two-step process. First, you do a pheno hunt to see what naturally does well there, but then you steer that crop towards the outputs that you want it to do. And that can be done in a few different ways. So for me, it's all about, and unfortunately, most companies don't budget for this, but the growing out, the pheno hunting phase is super important. If you want to find, especially if you want to find something unique and rare, or something that's well adapted from a batch that's not particularly well adapted, all these things are possible, but it becomes a case of numbers. Are you planting a few hundred seed? Are you planting a few thousand seeds? Are you planting a few tens of thousands of seed? This is the difference, and do you have the space, time, and resources to manage that, and then to keep score of all those individual plants? It's a huge, big network of, thing. So that's enter me, right? So instead of doing that, you say, okay, Gary, what should I grow in this environment? So that's where, my job is mostly in the last couple of years is selection, as you say, and working with people like Jorge, just have a fantastic take on you could drop him in the Arctic and I'm sure he would grow great weed. Do you know what I mean? It's like just, okay, there's levels to this for sure. But those selecting the right seeds comes from me selecting the right breeders and making sure they're reputable, not be getting, just any old seed because it's cheap. A lot of the good work that's been done, especially recently on adapted lines, for example, high, mold resistance for growing in the Caribbean, for example, where you do have really high humidity. That's important to get true breeders that know what they're doing behind that. Otherwise, you don't have the proper scoring matrix for the selection. So the pheno hunt itself is something that I scrutinize when I go into places as well, because I look at how they're scoring the plants, and there's clear signs of just missed opportunity. A lot of people associate fast growth and vigor with early emergence from seeds. Okay, and generally you always want fast-growing, vigorous plants, right? But what if that phenotype comes with a poor performance? It doesn't finish in time. There can be causations and correlations between traits, and it's we need to kind of sieve all these out over time. So it's a huge, big job, and it's often something people just show up to me and say, "All right, Gary, what's the best THC, highest THC you can give us?" And it's like, where are you growing? How are you growing? All of that stuff. So for me, what I've noticed is outdoor soil, sun-grown cannabis tends to win people over really easily. Not to say that you can't get really high-end indoor growing hydroponics or otherwise. You definitely do. I don't think there's one rule. It depends on the person and how they master the resources. But for me, if you can do indoor living soil, then that's the sweet spot, because you can control the environment, but you have that natural interaction between the microbes and the roots that help to stimulate all these different aspects of plant growth where we cannot help, like mobilization.
Yeah. It's interesting because we went to when we were in Canada recently, we went to a facility and got given a tour, and that's the first time we'd actually seen, and again, it was all indoor. What were they using, like coconut mass, weren't they, or biomass or something like that, in order to kind of kickstart things? And they had those sort of, what do you call them? There's kind of the things, those grow down things that, to get the seedlings. Not trying to do product plug there, it's just the only way I can remember them. Unless they want to pay, then hey, grow down, you've got money, we can talk about this. That's another issue. But again, just to sort of see that whole indoor thing, and I think the question is one of consistency, and you can grow plants consistently in a certain way, but will they necessarily yield the same amount of crop? Can because again, it's a plant at the end of the day, and they're all different. You can treat them the same way, you can give them the same amount of nutrients, water, and they might just do something different.
Yeah, I mean, two crazy examples of that, if I may. The first one was, there was a company I know in Canada as well, and they take all these clones. Like it was actually tissue culture derived. They did 25, and they put them in this tiny little propagator, just controlled environment, just flowered them. And then they measured the variance in the cannabinoid and terpenoid, and they found it varied by as much as 5%, and it was like, there's no discernible difference between one plant and the other, genetically or environmentally. So that's a factor, right? And then the second one is we're using the plant in a semi-unnatural way, because its natural life cycle will be pollinated and it will produce seeds. We hold the pollen back and we harvest the what we call flower, right, which is a strange tissue type, and that's another podcast entirely. But anyway, the that tissue is, I'm distracting myself there. That variance, right, is built into the plant, because as it's naturally designed to set seed, it's designed to do it at different times through the end of the season. So some parts of the plant will produce the seed before other parts of the plant. And that gives it a survival advantage, because it drops its seeds at different times, where environmentally the conditions are different each time. Some might get buried deeper, some might not get buried at all. And all this type of thing, you could go insane breaking down the different variables in it. But that in itself is genetically programmed not to be uniform at the same time, if that makes sense, on different parts of the plant. So,
it's such a technically deep topic, and certainly appreciate you talking to Dave and I like we don't know anything, because we definitely don't. It's like the perfect entry level is like the level of language you're using is bang on, because there's so much to it, and I'm sure you'll be the first person to say, like, there's so much you don't know, even though you're obviously an expert. There's such depth to it. I wonder long term, we're talking about quality and we're talking about genetics, and this is, I'm sure, something that's probably come across your desk before, but do you think that there are issues long term, in decades to come, with kind of narrowed lines of genetics as a result of overbreeding,
like the royal family kind of thing?
I wasn't going to say it.
Well, I've said it. I'm patriotic. You can see, so, but no, that is an interesting point.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, so let me. If I've been asked this question before, I've definitely said this before, which is we have to give credit to the work that's been done in the craziest of circumstances, in lofts and basements and backyards and guerrilla grows for the last God knows how many decades. But yet we've ended up with this array of cannabis flower that I'm not disappointed with. Are you guys disappointed with? You go to California or Canada, what's available there? You're not disappointed. So first of all, plaudits to that incredible, almost like a citizen science project. Let's all go out and individually breed these crazy lines, and then we'll bring them all together in legalization in 30, 40 years' time, and we'll reap the rewards. That's kind of what's happened. So in that respect, there's been a hell of a lot of inbreeding, is basically what you were saying, Jamie, and that has caused what we call now polyhybrids. So they're not truly being refined and selected for, so that they can only produce that one thing, which is how we do every other crop, is we make it what's called homozygous. So there's no variance in the gene. So if you've got it doesn't work as simply as this, but for example, if you had a gene that controlled the level of THC, which doesn't exist, one gene as far as we know, that could either be high or low, and you could have two different genes that would say one is high and one is low. When you do proper breeding in different crops, you make sure there's no variance there, that both genes that it has are high, for example. So that's a very crude way of saying that we do not make these lines completely reproducible, and then we breed with them, which means the progeny then is just scrambled eggs. You can find amazing phenos in there, but you can't get consistency from it, you know. So, but there is ways around that, obviously, if you do it properly, and there is people out there doing it properly as well. So yeah, I would say what we need to do is bring in more genetics from the origins, you know, of all these different land races and wild types, and bring them in, because there's actually there's evidence to suggest there's a whole divergent even subset of THC asynthase, which is the gene that synthesizes the precursor to THC. That actually can be variable. We've all the ones in the current populations is the same, but in those wild populations, there's variants of that THC asynthase gene. So to your point, yeah, there's interesting things for us as consumers still down the line, but as long as we have those wild populations, we're not really in jeopardy of hurting the gene pool, but we might want to start mixing it up a little bit more, so we don't always. At one point we could all end up with the same stuff, or we could end up with a disease that rips through everything and becomes an international problem to manage. You know, it's happened with Panama disease and bananas. They're almost extinct because of that. We checked in on that for a few years, so yeah, have a quick Google of that before. But anyway, and then there's you know, in this country we have ash dieback, which is a rare disease that I think came from Asia and is ripping through, or it came from, I can't remember which way around, but we're either using the Asian versions of ash to counter it, or the disease came from there and we're using Norwegian versions of ash to counter it. One of the two, I can't remember. But you have these diseases that can wipe through an entire species out, and obviously with the controlled environments in which we tend to grow, it's unlikely to really manifest in such a dramatic way as I'm saying. But the point is, it could become a real problem for everyone, and not just those who can't manage the environment, you know, who tend to get disease problems, I guess.
That's crazy. But no, I mean, it makes a lot of sense what you're saying. I'm thinking around, I mean, I mentioned royal family, but also thinking around kind of dogs and overbreeding, like to get certain characteristics. Yeah. And then it gets to the point where it's not healthy for the dog to look like this, because it seriously impedes its kind of quality of life, because it's got, you know, tiny legs and a heavy body, or, you know, it's got that sort of thing. I suppose
the dashend of cannabis is what you say.
Dashend, but again, but it's interesting. I mean, one of the things we wanted to talk about as well was around sort of seeds and, you know, where to get them from, and what the sort of, I mean, not necessarily endorsing that people home grow, even though that would be cool if that was legal here. But again, the whole thing around, you know, there are, you know, trusted sources from which to get seeds from if you are going to be growing, and, you know, and there are also some, you know, nefarious players as well. And how do you kind of, what does kind of good look like in that sense, and what should you be looking for, and what should you be doing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I just recently wrote an article on this actually for seedsmen, because, you know, the less scrupulous players out there, like people who have fake accounts that pretend to be a social media account, for example, they're calling people into buying seeds directly and stuff like that, which is just, you know, either the seeds don't show up or they're just something completely random. Mm-hmm. But there's ways to counter it. So there's that, and then there's also the actual legitimate websites out there who have basically rebranded seeds as a branded version. So they'll sell this is like, you know, Barney's Farm or Dutch Passion or Sensei Seeds, you know, but actually it's not.
Right.
You know, those ones are basically just lying and being deceptive. So yeah, there's a few things you can do though. I mean, validation of the packaging, for example, is a good one, because good breeders and good seed banks would spend a lot of money on their packaging because it's their identity. You know, so if you buy seeds for somewhere dodgy in the shop in a little baggie, you know, with a little handwritten note on them saying, you know, caramel cream auto, then
that would probably yield something amazing, I'd imagine, if it was that kind of. But again, it's a red flag, right?
Yeah, exactly. And again, it's a hard thing to do, because the larger questions about scamming and different types of fraudulent behaviors that go on, I'd say just go to reputable websites. You know, there's a bunch of seed banks out there that have been established for a long time, for example, bunch of breeders. Like I mentioned, the Dutch guy, all those Dutch guys, they've been there for a while. You kind of know what you're getting with them. There's, they've got reputation. They're not in business for 20 odd years and bad at it. So there's that. But then there's also these amazing new modern breeders. A lot of them, I guess, for us in Europe, we say modern because it's stuff we've not been exposed to from California and in Canada and all this stuff, and loads of other states, Colorado, there's tons of them, Oregon, really big cannabis states that we should mention. And I get excited whenever I hear about a new special cross that's come from lines that have been, especially if they've come from different parts of the world. Because if we take a step back to the question in biodiversity in cannabis, just for the listeners who don't know, the further you are away from relatedness, the more vigorous the offspring will be generally. So if you're that's why they don't allow cousins to marry, right? Because the kids are not going to be really good at sports or academically or anything like that. Generally,
or that's just the Victorian royal family, wasn't it? Actually,
yeah.
Marry a cousin and see what shakes out. Oh, there we go. Anyway, don't do that in cannabis. It's not a good thing. Or just don't do that generally. There's a reason that if it's too close genetically, then stuff's not going to come out the right way necessarily.
Yeah.
This is nature. This is not opinion.
Yeah, exactly. And then the other thing I like to do for validation is just ask people in the community, have you grown this from these guys? How was it? That's a very important point that often doesn't get mentioned, because we are the community. And this is the thing, that one of the great things about cannabis for me is I generally love the people involved in it. That we go to these events, we've hung out a few times at these things, and it's just fantastic. And generally
so good.
Open, honest people who you want to spend your time with. And that's a good indication, I think, of if you've got someone who's a bit of a, I don't know what you would say politely on a podcast, but there's certainly a few Scottish words I could use, but someone who's not very nice, let's just say, you don't do any business with them, because they're generally up to something, and reputation is everything for people in cannabis, I think, especially in the markets that haven't had an opportunity to flourish just yet. As you mentioned, home grow and recreational and things like that, where we see it in other places do really well, and we can learn from it really valuable lessons, for when it comes here.
No, absolutely. And again, on that note, if for example, political ramifications aside, if home grow was legal tomorrow, if we could grow our own cannabis, if we could enjoy it, what would you like to see happen? What is what would be best practice from a kind of growing perspective that you think, people should start, adopt if you're coming at this for the first time, if it's allowed, if it, just where do they start, I suppose, and how do we do it right? Yeah.
For cultivation or for regulation?
I guess no, for cultivation.
Cultivation.
Yeah.
Yeah, so again, it's a bit of both. The answer, the old system in Canada where you had the micro growers and they had a license to grow for so many patients. I think that's a genius move. I would love to see that here, because the reason why I like that is for those who are so sick that they can't physically manage their own grow, it gives them an opportunity to not only decide what is being grown for them, but to go to someone who they trust is reputable and have it grown to a certain standard, and it's direct. There's no middlemen. There's no, it makes it all nice and clean for me. That's what I would like to see, Dave, is that kind of system. And then people can choose, I was with this guy for a while. I liked it for a bit, but now my tastes are actually more in this direction. So I'm going to go and give people that opportunity to move. In terms of cultivation yourself, again, something that's overlooked in the commercial industry is like, how many plants do you have versus how many people are watching each of those plants? If I'm watching one plant, that's going to be the best plant on the planet, right? If I'm watching 10 plants, though, not so much. You see what I mean? If I'm 100, then oh my God. You see what I mean? It gets harder to be a really good grower the more you divide your attention over different plants and different techniques. I would say start simple. Learn how the plants grow naturally. Try a few from different backgrounds. I don't like to use these terms because in polyhybridization world, they don't mean as much as they once did. But having different indicas and sativa type plants, what I mean really in that term is different growing types. So and indicas typically are short and stocky, whereas sativas are typically long and lanky, right? So two very different growth patterns, and you should play with both of them and just watch how it naturally goes. Then the next time round, why don't you top them and see how that changes it? Then the next time round, do a scrog net and they just have a play whilst you're in that early stage. Because later on you overthink everything and you're scared to make a move once you know what you're doing. But in those early days, you should just keep playing with the system, keep changing it, try something new each time, and then you'll really quickly find your wheelhouse, and you'll find the genetics you like and the growing method you like and the one that's most productive for you. So yeah, that would be my advice.
No, I think that's awesome. And I think, again, it just highlights the fact that so much about whether you're a patient trying your own, which strains work for me, or, you're a grower, like, how do I do this? What's the best way of doing that? There's so much need for kind of experimentation and personal kind of, monitoring in terms of how to get the most out of this plant, that, sort of the inability to do that is kind of what's holding it back. So it's a bit of a catch-22. But as a sort of final question for you, again, how long do you think before we'll get kind of recreational legalization here in the UK?
In the UK? Oh, man. So there's for me, there's always the long shot that some general election gets called and some minority party wins and we get some bonus cannabis reform from that. So, but we'll just park that bus for a second. And I would think at minimum 5 years, more realistically pushing 10. And to be honest with you, I mean, well, let me ask first, where do you guys see that? The same question.
I would agree with you. I think we need Labour are probably going to be in for 2 terms at least, based on current Conservative performance. So I think that it's not going to be in the first term for sure. So that's 4 years down the line. So it's going to be something they start pushing in the second if they're doing well and if they fixed, frankly, much bigger problems. We all want legal cannabis, but we all also don't want 29% food inflation and energy prices through the roof. Those things are more important to everyone. So if they can fix the big problems, then they can start looking at ones that are very important to us but less important to the country as a whole. So I think from today, maybe 6-7 years.
And I think conversely that just to play devil's advocate, it could be just like, oh, all this other shit's going on, let's legalize cannabis just to distract everyone, and try and get some tax money. I mean, that could be absolutely. It's crazy, isn't it? But again, I think that sort of 5 to maybe 7 or 8 years or something feels realistic. But then depending what happens in Germany, and again, even if there is a kind of domino effect across the EU, which fingers crossed there will be, it's going to be like still Britain sitting on the sidelines going, oh, look what everyone else is doing.
That's what I was just going to ask you guys. I mean, like, how much do you think we've already missed the opportunity? Because as we already know, we're already importing, right? Which at one point, I'm sure we claimed to be the biggest exporter of cannabis products in the world, but we now import to our own system, which is bizarre. And, and I don't see that really changing anytime soon necessarily. But if all these other countries open up, all we'll be doing is importing. There'll be nothing to export when we get a chance. So, Dave, how much do you think we've missed the opportunity to actually fully capitalize on that?
I think it's like it's the old thing, isn't it? The best time to do it was 5 years ago. The next best time is now, isn't it? That's the thing of it. And I think we've missed an opportunity? I think it's a case of we need to understand what it is. I don't think really the government, people in the UK understand the implications of what it means or what the potential for, health. There's so many unknown unknowns. That's what I feel like right now. And I feel like there needs to be that kind of education piece, but there needs to be appetite for that. There needs to be, again, looking at, the way in which doctors are educated and, need to understand more about it to kind of get this more robust medical. Just so many kind of things that need to fall into place. But again, it's whether that approach, that rigorous approach to understanding it is taken, or whether we just kind of do a fuck it, let's just legalize it and see what happens. And, either would be fine, in my opinion.
Yeah, same. And I guess just to wrap that up, I would say that not all moves are good moves as well, and like I would actually like to see us change the hemp laws before the cannabis laws, because that's choking a potential vibrant industry right now. And for those of you who don't know, farmers in the UK cannot harvest the top third of the plant what's called the
Yes.
resinous tops. So they have to discard it, irrespective of cannabinoid content or THC
It's
content.
throwing profit away, or potential profit, because they
Yeah.
can only harvest the sticks and the stems and all of that kind of stuff. But
And there's a global shortage of hemp as well, which is, I mean, it's such a valuable resource right now. It's been innovated in so many fantastic ways.
yes,
And it's just a shame that we cannot, in the UK, capitalise on that. You know, when we've got such champions of industry within the country,
yes,
and that's really disappointing for me, because it's such a lesser evil, I guess, and even the stigma-wise, it's even got less stigma attached to it. So,
but again, as a plant scientist, hemp and cannabis, exact same thing. It's just it's the exact same plant.
Yeah, if you can still breed with viable offspring, then it's still the same species, and all the characterization of hemp has been done through regulators and people like that. It's not actually, there's nothing that defines it in any way from a plant science perspective. Genetically, there's some key differences, but they're not distinguishable, if you know what I mean. You have to know the markers to look for, otherwise you can't tell the difference.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're the same thing, but which is why I like the idea of getting the hemp first, because then I can make the argument, well, that's the same species, so you can't have one rule for half the species and not for the other half, you know.
Absolutely.
I think that's where we've missed out. If there's like 3 parts of cannabis, if there's hemp and then there's medical and then there's rec and there's some overlap in between a couple of them, I think that's we've missed rec from like you look in the UK, it's very popular, and in parts of Europe, microbrewing culture, that side of things. We are still an enormous exporter of medical cannabis, and I think we probably will be, because we have such a strength in it already, but we're missing out on the other part, and I think that will kind of come to the fore. And hemp is just ridiculous. You know, we're a country that's just built on agricultural land. We are just designed for hemp. Like, we could have so much of it. It could do so much and create a lot of jobs. And we're definitely missing a trick.
And just quickly on that, I mean, you plant a cannabis seed next to any other seed and watch them grow. Not much grows as fast as cannabis can grow. And I'm talking about some of the powerhouses like sugarcane, you know, and plants like that tower are a really good Chinese hemp cultivar. They'll reach like 5-6 meters and they'll do it in one season. You know, it's like, that's the kind of thing we need everywhere with a society that's worried about carbon accumulation and things like that. You know, it's kind of a no-brainer. And again, common sense doesn't seem to be prevailing here, which is just a bit disappointing, you know.
Yeah, all in good time. Well, this has been great. Thank you so much, Gary. And yeah, we will speak again. Absolutely. But but no, thank you for sharing your insights and your expertise, and you know, always in education. So thank you very much, sir.
Well,
and,
thanks very much for having me. I always love talking to you guys. It's always insightful for me as well. So yeah, good to share ideas and do it in public sometimes as well.
Absolutely, sir.
Yeah.
Good stuff. Alrighty.
Thanks very much, Gary.
Thank you. Alrighty, we'll see you soon. Cheers, bye.